So welcome to Promethean Actions weekly class for June 21st, 2025 with Bruce Director. The real superintelligence is in your mind. Many Americans are being confused by sales spiels from high-paid salesmen for artificial intelligence. But the questions, the basic issues are susceptible to a solution on the basis of principle, which we've been discussing in other recent classes with Bruce. And he's going to carry that further tonight, as I said, under the heading, The Real Superintelligence is in Your Mind. So, Bruce.
Okay, thank you. So, as Tony said, a lot of people there's a lot of hype, a lot of discussion about artificial intelligence and what this is going to do to our economy. It seems to be playing a major role in keeping the stock market up, at least certain elements of the stock market. There's a lot of speculation, a lot of money is flowing into it. Mark Zuckerberg is saying he wants to pay $100 million bonuses to artificial intelligence specialists to come work for him. There seems to be a race on about this, and a lot of great promises which are being made about how this is going to transform the economy and transform everyone's lives. Now, let me say at the outset that I'm not someone who believes that there's no that there's not a great benefit to economic productivity from advanced microprocessors and major developments in robotics and other types of advanced forms of compute. And the engineering behind these machines is quite ingenious and quite dramatic. Of course, one of the things that, as I mentioned in my last class, which seems to be stunning a lot of people, is that there had been a previous illusion that as we enter the digital economy through the internet and so forth, that this was somehow green and required less physical inputs than an industrial economy. And of course, now everybody is having to admit that the physical input requirements to run these machines that people call artificial intelligence processors are, is quite large. So you're talking not just about concentrating large amounts of money and skilled engineers employed in designing, producing, and running these devices, but you're talking about a significant deployment of the physical capability of the economy. And I think some of the figures on the amount of electricity that's required are quite shocking in terms of the comparison to the amount of electricity that's needed to run daily life compared to what it is to run these machines, which is why some of these companies like Microsoft are trying to contract to buy the entire electrical output of the nuclear power plant in order to be able to supply electricity to run these devices. So the physical economic characteristics of that, I'll leave to another discussion. But the thing I wanted to discuss tonight, and I'm going to try and do this in a somewhat pedagogical way, is to demystify, at least to some degree, what we're actually talking about here. Now, the problem, I believe, is not that people don't understand what artificial intelligence is, but and what these, various forms of compute devices are, but they don't really have a sense of what thinking is. And I want to give a little bit of an illustration tonight, a little experiment, very simple, but very profound, that might at least get you thinking about this in a certain way. Um, the Because they well, let me just say that a lot of big claims are made. There's one that came out today on X by Elon Musk, who seems to be very enamored with this, somewhat concerned. But I'm looking for it here. Hang on a second. Yeah, here it is. So Elon put out on X today, we will use Grok 3.5. That's his AI engine. Maybe we should call it 4, which has advanced reasoning to rewrite the entire corpus of human knowledge, adding missing information and deleting errors. Then retrain on that. Far too much garbage in any foundation model trained on uncorrected data. Now, if I understand what Musk is saying there, what he said this in many times in speeches that he's given, that the large language models and these AI programs have run out of human generated input to train the model on. And therefore, they need to create machine generated input in order to train the models on. And I think it's quite hubristic, to say the least, to say that he's going to have a machine go through the entire corpus of human knowledge and correct all the errors and delete the garbage and then retrain the machine on that. Now, what kind of result could possibly come from that other than a synthetic representation of what is called human knowledge? And of course, as most of you probably realize, is that these large language models are not evaluating the idea content of the input. They're evaluating the text content of the input, just the words, the order of the words, and how to mimic the ordering of the words into some type of representation, which people would be able to read into it as if it were coming from an actual human mind. Now, again, I'm not saying that for purposes of processing very large amounts of data to be able to discover patterns or connections and so forth, that cannot be really done by even a large number of human beings, is not a very useful exercise or very useful capability. And I think even more important is the ability to process large amounts of actual real world data, which Musk himself is doing with his Tesla self-driving mode, where he's collecting real world data from the Teslas, which are driving all over the world right now, and processing that to be able to train his vehicles to be able to drive even better than a human being would drive. That's a different story. But the idea that this is super intelligence is just simply wrong. And I think I can illustrate that by just talking about the very, very basic principle or operation that a computer and a human mind does. Let me start by reading you a quote from Aeschylus in his famous play Prometheus Bound. And of course, we called ourselves the Promethean Action for a reason, and we're referring to this in part to this mythical Greek figure, Prometheus, who I think, as we've talked about before, and most people know, was a demigod who gave fire to man, according to the Greek myth, and who was punished by Zeus for that betrayal and doomed to be chained to a rock in the Caucasus Mountains and have an eagle pick his liver out every day, and only to grow back at night and then to be picked out again the next day. So he was anti-oligarchy, at least in the myth. Now, in the play, it's a different story. It's based on the myth, but it's a work of art by Aeschylus. And in that play, he has Prometheus speaking from his place where he's chained, talking about what he did. And again, this is a work of art. This is not a biblical text or anything else. Just it's a speech in a play, but it describes a universal idea, a thought-provoking idea about the nature of man. So I'll read this section of human sufferings and how at first senseless as beasts, I gave man sense, possessed them of mind. I speak not in contempt of man. I do but tell of good gifts I conferred. In the beginning, seeing they saw a mist, and hearing heard not, but like phantoms, huddled in dreams and perplexed, and the perplexed story of their days confounded, knowing neither timber work nor brick-built dwellings basking in the light, but dug for themselves holes wherein like ants they hardly may contend against a breath. They dwelt in burrows of their unused caves. Neither of winter's cold had they fixed sign, nor of the spring when she comes decked with flowers, nor yet of summer's heat with melting fruits sure token, but utterly without knowledge, moiled until I the rising of the stars showed them, and when they set, though much obscure, moreover, number, the most excellent of all inventions, I for them devised, and gave them writing that retaineth all. And he goes on to talk. So I want to focus on this question of number as the greatest invention of this all. Now, what is the idea of number? This is, as Prometheus says, this is the greatest invention of them all, and we take number very much for granted, although great thinkers have not. They actually delved deeply into this, and I'm speaking particularly the ancient Greeks, Pythagoreans. Euclid in his Elements has a couple of books on number and the nature of numbers. And of course, probably the most famous person to delve very, very deeply into the nature of numbers was the great 19th century, 18th, 19th century German scientist Carl Friedrich Gauss. So I think this is an interesting thing to think about because people associate numbers with computers. And just think about the difference. I want to demonstrate a little bit the difference between the way a human mind actually thinks about the number and what a computer actually does. Now, let's start with the computer. Now, I know there's probably a lot of computer experts, probably in the audience, many of whom know a lot more about the inner workings of computers than I do, who may say that I'm oversimplifying and so forth, which I probably am. But I think if you think about it, whether we're talking about, a computer or a microprocessor or some, more rudimentary mechanical computer like Leibniz's computing machines or Babbage's machines, which worked on gears and so forth. Um, we lose sight of the fact that um, we're dealing with a physical process, and we're attributing to that physical process human concepts such as number. Um, as most people realize, the when we speak of number, of a computer number, you think about, punching 1 + 2 keys on your keyboard and out comes, or on your calculator and out comes 3. But, I think if you know what goes on the inside of these things, there really is no difference between what people conceive of as software or they think of as instructions and the hardware, the actual toggling of voltages or the turning on and off of switches in various configurations, or a mechanical machine, the turning of gears on a common axle and so forth, like on the Babbage machine. That what you're doing is you're creating a physical process, either mechanical or electronic. The electronic obviously is superior because it's much more efficient, and basically turning switches on and off. And we on the very rudimentary level, and again, disclaimer, I know that I'm way oversimplifying here, but when you get right down to the very rudimentary level, what we call a computer number is a series of switches in on-off positions, varying positions of on and off, which are signify ones and zeros, and various configurations of switches which function as logical operators, such as and, or, and so forth. And I don't want to get deep into the weeds of how that works. The computer people on the call might want to add to this, but fundamentally it's a mechanical process which human beings created, and which human beings attribute the significance and the meaning to those configurations. In other words, we don't give instructions to a computer and the computer follows our instructions and then gives us an answer. It's not like my little dog here, which I'll say quiet, and hopefully he'll be quiet. Or I give him an instruction and say sit, and he sits. That's not what a computer is. The dog is a living process that operates in the world according to biology and living capabilities and cognitive capabilities of the animal and in relation to a human being. But a computer or a mechanical device which does not have a concept of number, we give it the concept of number. And for various reasons relating to, the design and the decisions about making designs of these devices in the early development stage of these calculating machines and computers, we settled on, a digital architecture that generated basically switches that are either on or off, and from that we can attribute to the on and the off a number 1, a number 0, and a binary system that then we can attribute all numbers. Now, let me give you a little example of the limitation of that compared to thinking. And I'm doing this not to illustrate a particular mathematical principle or anything like that, but simply to give you a little exercise in how to think about number. Because we don't really think about number. People think about number. When you say number, you think things, 1, 2, 3, counting things, right? And that, when I add numbers together, I have 2 things, 3 things, I put them together and I get 5 things, so forth. And you can, again, I'm just limiting this to simple counting numbers, but there are all kinds of other numbers which are associated with actual, real physical or intellectual ideas. So let's just take the simplest ones, right? The counting numbers. And, a computer or mechanical device or in our mind, right? We can generate numbers in a very simple way by simply adding 1, starting with the idea of 1 being one thing or one object, just for purposes of this exercise, and adding another 1 to it, and we get 2. And then you add a third thing to it, and now you're at 3. And you add a 4th thing to it, and now you're at 4. And you go on and on and on. And this process seems to have no end. Tony, you could put up that first figure, so I can illustrate. People can see this. Might be easier. Some people have an easier time looking at numbers. Okay, yeah, that's it. Okay, so you can see the top line. That's a representation of that thought of adding 1. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Now, from that concept that I enunciated here, the thing that distinguishes one of those numbers from its preceding number is the addition of 1, and from a succeeding number, it's the thing you add 1 to. And you can add other things, but these numbers are pretty much recognizable or from each other, distinguished from each other simply by the unit 1. And a computer can easily represent that, a mechanical device can easily represent that by a series of switches on and off in series that will to which we can reliably attribute a coherence with this concept of number of just adding one, if we think of that just as a simple formal process. Now, there's another way to think about generating numbers, which comes from a physical process. Initially, and I should have drawn a picture of this to make it easier for you. This was, I don't know when it was discovered, probably in a very, very ancient times, but the first written discussions of it are in, I think, even Babylonian texts. But you see it most developed in the Greek texts and attributed to the Pythagoreans. And that's the idea of doubling. Plato talks about this in tripling and quadrupling. Plato talks about this in the Theaetetus dialogue, which I encourage everyone to read. And he talks about the idea of having a square, and you're doubling the size of the square. And so you get what you start with. In this case, we'll do it symbolically with the number 2, and you double 2 and you get to 4, and you double 4 and you get to 8, and you double 8 and you get to 16, and you double 32 and you get to 64, and you double 64, you get to 128. And we, in this process, can create an infinite number of numbers that will all be found in the series 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, etc. But if you see where I put the little asterisk there, you see that there are numbers that are in the series of adding 1 that will never, ever be generated by the process of doubling. So now, if we start to take some of the numbers from that we know exist because we generated them by adding 1 and incorporating them into this process, we can begin to fill things out a bit. So you have the 3, put the 3 into the mix. And so now we can generate 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, again, 9, 3 times 3, 12, 16, 18, and so forth. But we're missing some still. So let's pull 5, which is the next one that we missed, put that in the mix, and you see we can generate more numbers. 2, 3, 4, 6, we miss 7, 8, 9, 10, miss 11, 12, 13, 14, we miss that, 15, 16, so on. Now we go on, and now let's add 7 to the mix, and we put 7 in there, and you see we get more.
So what you're doing is the way it's not so clear to me as you, but what you're doing here is taking 2, 3, and 4, and then 6 is a number which can be obtained by multiplying 2, 3, and 4. Ditto 8, ditto 9. Is that what it is?
Right.
Ditto 12.
Yeah.
And 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Now you add 5 to the mix.
You add 5. Yeah, okay.
So you can use 5 and making combinations of 5 with 2, and 3.
Yeah.
4 you get from 2.
Yeah.
You can make a whole bunch more numbers. But you'll still miss some, a whole lot, that come out of the series 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, etc. Then we add 7, and in the next line, and in the next line, I added 11. And then in the final line, which actually ends up on 2 lines, I added 13 to the mix. And you see, as we begin to add into our multiplication generation, the numbers that are left out, we begin to fill in all the numbers. Okay. So think about that for a minute. And now I'm going to introduce something which is very important for all human thinking, which no computer can do. In fact, most people don't do it, but it's the key to all science and really the key to all developing all knowledge and art, which is the principle of inversion. Here I've produced a thought example, I guess is a way to thought object, that there are two different ways to generate, thinking about generating the series of counting of natural numbers in two different ways. And by understanding this process, we can come to the realization that ultimately, and I use the term ultimately as ultimately, that is in the overall, were we to be able to do this process to its total conclusion, which of course this is a paradox because it has no end, they would give us both the same result. That is, all the numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all the counting numbers will be generated by this process of multiplication, but in a different order. In other words, if we look at this first line, 2, 4, 8, etc., we'll generate some really, really big powers of 2, very large numbers, long before we get to them by adding 1. But if we keep extracting from the natural numbers, the counting numbers, the numbers that are generated by adding 1, if we keep extracting from them the process of these numbers that get left out, then we'll fill in all the holes and we'll have a complete set of all counting numbers. The two sets will all have the same elements in it. But now let's invert that process because here we generated these numbers, at least in the first instance, by adding 1. And so 1 was our primary element. But when we look at it from the standpoint of generating these numbers in the multiplicative way, we find that the numbers that are left out that can't be generated that way, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13, and other such numbers, are really the numbers that generate all the others. So like 6, it's generated by 2 and 3. 12 is generated by 3 and 4, etc. And these numbers, of course, the Greeks understood, they called them prime numbers. And here you have to think about what I'm saying in terms of the principle of inversion, because the numbers that are prime, that are, in a sense, the fundamental elements of natural numbers, are not numbers that are generated by adding 1, but numbers that are generated by something else which we cannot actually define. Why is 5 a prime number and 6 not? Now you could say, well, because 5 has no factors and 6 does. Well, that's the definition. But why is it that way? Why do these numbers, why do you have the order that they have? How come, just for example, you have 2, 3, 5, 7, they're all the odd numbers in a row, and then you have 3 numbers in a row before you get to 11, and then you have 13, which is just one number separated by it. So the more you look at these prime numbers, the more one begins to realize that these prime numbers are actually the fundamental counting numbers, and the counting numbers that are generated by adding 1 might be easier to generate, but this property of primeness can never be discerned from the process of adding 1. So that causes us to, using the principle of inversion, ask ourselves, what is it that this numbers reflect? What is this principle that this reflects? I'll give you tell you the the end of the story in this regard is that despite all the work that all the mathematicians and thinkers have done to date, no one has been able to figure out a formula that generates the primes, or any type of principle that generates the prime numbers, or anything better than a approximation, which was done by Gauss, of the distribution of the primes. You can see that they stretch out as the numbers get higher. They get further and further apart. But you could, when you calculate this, and people have been able to do it, Gauss did it to something like numbers up to 10,000 digits, I believe. He made a huge table of prime numbers. That even though the number, the distance, so to speak, between the primes gets greater and greater, it's not uniform. And you may have no prime numbers for a large number of numbers, and then 2 in a row, or separated by an even. So this, if you let this sink in, is a really fascinating paradox, because we didn't generate these numbers by any complicated set of rules and procedures. And we also didn't generate these numbers by any relationship to a particular physical object, although we know that numbers such as these do correlate. We can correlate them with actual physical objects, and yet embed it without our intention in the beginning in this simple process is something very fundamental and profound that that only tells us that there's a higher principle that's existing behind the logic and the perceptions than what is evident in what we attributed this. Now, this is, in my view, is a complete distinction between the thinking human mind and the computer. Now, I'm not saying computers can't deal with prime numbers. They can, because man has the concept of a prime number and created machines to follow physical routines that conform to our notion of prime numbers that we can use then to represent these numbers for ourselves, just like I used a computer to write these numbers down. But to this day, of course, although again I'm oversimplifying, the basic principle which I used here, which is a modified version of an ancient Greek discovery called the sieve of Eratosthenes. This is an inverted version of that. That process is still the only process by which to extract out prime numbers from these from the idea of the counting numbers. You can do very sophisticated and ingenious forms of operations to speed up the process in a microprocessor and so forth. But fundamentally, conceptually, it's no different. Now, let me do something which probably will confuse most people. But I'm going to do it anyway, because I think it just to show you that there's a higher, even a deeper structure to these prime numbers than what I've just illustrated, although I think this is pretty deep. So now here we extracted the prime numbers out of a set of all numbers. Let's now just examine one prime number in relation to this process of doubling, tripling, etc. So first I want to introduce an idea that doesn't originate with Gauss, but he basically made it famous. And this of course has is an element of the binary number system. But as you see here, I've drawn a circle. I did this because I couldn't figure out how to, my computer doesn't have the program to do drawing. So I've just made a clock face, but the clock face has just 5 digits on it. And, this takes that one prime number 5 and limits all the numbers to that. So we just have these. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 would be the same as 1. 7 would be the same as 2. 8 would be the same as 3. I don't know. This is reverse because I'm looking at a computer. But anyway, I think you get the idea. And so Gauss said, let's think about these types of numbers. And you can do the same thing for 7. Think about these types of numbers the way a musician thinks about intervals. So 5 is your key. And just like in a musical scale, you have the 8 notes of the scale. And when you get to the octave, they repeat each other at a higher pitch, but the tone is the same in relation to the other tones. So you have this, what musicians would call a key, and Gauss called a modulus. And when the interval between 2 numbers is the same as the modulus, then those 2 numbers, Gauss said, were congruent to each other. Not equal, because they're not the same, but they're congruent because relative to that interval, they're the same, just like middle C and the C higher than it are congruent to each other because they sound exactly the same, except the higher C is an octave higher. Excuse my voice. So now You can put up the next chart, Tony, which I'm sure will, people will say, where did you get this from? I'll tell you. And the interesting thing is the result. And I will maybe develop in a future discussion some more details of this, but mainly I want to show you this. This is something that Gauss didn't invent, but he explored more than anyone else. Now, you can see up at the very top row of the first group, I have the numbers that we generate simply from 2, which is basically a process of doubling. So you 1, 2, you double 2, you get 4, you double 4, you get 8, you double 8, you get 16, and so on and so forth. So that's a very simple number. So now, or simple process, but you see it's an infinite process. Now let's look at that sequence relative to the key of 5, or as Gauss would call it, modulo 5. And so you're looking at what are the numbers that are congruent to these numbers 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, and so forth, modulo 5. And you see that you get 1, 2, 4, 3, 1, 2, 4, 3. And if you were to keep getting this, it would repeat itself over and over and over again. So I think that's kind of beautiful that you have what appears to be an ever-growing geometrical progression, but in the key of 5, it turns into a beautiful cycle. And if you do the same progression with respect to mod 7, the key of 7, you see it a little bit different here. It goes 1, 2, 4, 1, 2, 4, 1, 2, 4. Now, the difference is that in the key of 5, all the numbers between 1 and 4 are used up. It's a complete period. But in the key of 7, it just uses 1, 2, and 4. What happened to 3, 5, and 6? But you see that it repeats itself in a cycle. Now let's do the same thing with respect to these 2 keys with a geometric progression based on tripling. So you start with 1, triple it to 3, triple that to 9, triple that to 27, triple that to 81, triple that to 243, and so on and so forth. And now look at that relative to the key of 5, or modulo 5, and you get a period 1, 3, 4, 2, which is different order than, but all 5 numbers. But then when you look at it with the key of 7, you get 1, 3, 2, 6, 4, 5. So all of them, all the numbers from 1 to 7 are in there in a different order. So in the key, with respect to 2, doubling, 7 does 1, 2, 4, 1, 2, 4. And in the key of 7, with respect to tripling, you get the whole period. Now, Gauss, I don't know if he came up with the term or somebody else did, but what he made it famous anyway. And he said that this is, in this respect, I would say that 2, because it's doubling, and 3, because it's tripling, produce a complete period in the key of 5, that those numbers 2 and 3 are what he called primitive roots of 5. And in the key of 7, 2 is not a primitive root, but 3 is of 7. Now, I know that went way out on a limb, but I just wanted to show it to you to see that this rich structure that exists behind the simple logical formation of numbers, which are so common to our knowledge. And yet, there's a rich structure behind it that draws us into wanting to understand what is this structure. Now, okay, you can take that down to me. So, in this sense, I present this not because there's some practical uses for this, although there are. And in fact, all encryption today is based on these two principles that keeps your bank account safe and keeps Bitcoin from becoming worthless, for example, and keeps your communications private and so forth. It's all based, at least to some degree, on this characteristic of primitive roots and prime numbers. So it does have a practical purpose, but I think today it has an even more important practical purpose, which that it illustrates or is an exercise which should give you a sense that there's a quality of thinking that we do in our minds, which is outside the capability of any machine, or in fact, any other living creature. And that really is, to me, the most important issue in the debate over artificial intelligence is not what the machines can or cannot do, but what the mind demonstrably can do. Now, can you simulate what I discussed tonight using a machine? Absolutely. As I say, that's what encryption is based on to a large degree. But can the machine discover it? Absolutely not. Because only the human mind has that capability of applying the principle of inversion to tease out the existence of a structure which is beyond not only our sense perception, but underlying the structure of our thoughts that of which we were completely unaware. I could say a lot more, but I think it would be best to open it up for questions and dialogue to get a little bit better sense of how much I might have confused you.